All right, well, welcome everyone. We're so glad you could join us tonight. My name is Misty Bose. I'm the U.S. Conservation Policy Manager for the Wildlands Network, and my organization works to prevent biodiversity loss and promote climate change resilience through science-based research and innovative policy. We collaborate with local partners and people just like you to empower communities across North America to safeguard their wild spaces. And we're so glad you could join us tonight for this webinar. First, we're going to hear from Ben Goldfarb, and then Delegate Ruth will tell us more about current wildlife crossing legislation that's happening right now in Maryland. But first, I'd like to turn it over to Logan Christian from the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators, who was kind enough to co-host this webinar tonight with us. Take it away, Logan.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much, Misty, for organizing this and the opportunity to be here. And it's great to see you, Ben, and Delegate Ruth, who we work closely with in Maryland. So I'm Logan Christian. I'm the Wildlife and Habitat Coordinator with the National Caucus of Environmental Legislators. So NCEL is a nationwide network of over 1,300 state legislators who are working on environmental policy issues. And we support this network by offering targeted environmental policy research, policy options, and resources from other states, as well as convening like-minded legislators to create a shared space for learning to better address environmental issues through state policymaking. We are really excited to hear from Ben Goldfarb tonight, who has, helped draw a lot of attention to the issue of wildlife crossings with his new book, as well as from Maryland Delegate Ruth, who has been an active legislative champion on wildlife conservation over the years, including this year with 2 bills related to habitat connectivity. I wanted to give a plug for the other bill on pollinator habitats along highways. So it's been incredible to see state legislators working so much more on the issue of habitat connectivity in recent years. You might have just heard Ben mentioning the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, which helped galvanize and provide a lot of funding for this. So it's a great time to be thinking about wildlife crossings. Just last year, 11 states enacted 18 bills related to wildlife corridors and crossings, and we've already seen 13 states introduce 25 bills this year. So a lot of incredible momentum. So excited to kind of hear about what's happening on the ground and all the research Ben did for his book tonight, as well as hearing from a legislator champion working actively in this space to protect wildlife crossings. So with that, I will turn it back to Misty to introduce Ben.
Yeah, and real quick, Logan, would you mind mentioning how you'd like folks to share their questions tonight?
Yes, thank you. I almost forgot about that. So if folks could post your questions in the chat, I will be monitoring the chat throughout and keeping a list of questions. So we'll make sure we can address as many of those as possible. I might have to bunch a few questions together if there's a lot. And we'll save all the questions for the end. So after both Ben's presentation as well as Delegate Ruth's, we'll make sure there's plenty of time for Q&A.
Great, thank you. And yeah, we're going to try to keep the event to under an hour and a half, ideally just over an hour if we can do it, but we don't want to limit anyone's questions, so we will take the time we need. Ben just left, but I would like to introduce him while he's away. Hi, Ben. All right, so Ben Goldfarb, we are so glad to have tonight, is an environmental journalist whose work has appeared in National Geographic, The Atlantic, Smithsonian Magazine, and many other publications. He's the author of the fabulous book, Crossings, How Road Ecology is Shaping the Future of Our Planet, which he'll be talking about tonight. And it was named one of the best books of 2023 by the New York Times and the New Yorker. His previous book, Eager, The Surprising Secret Life of Beavers and Why They Matter, received the Penn E.O. Wilson Literary Science Writing Award. He currently lives in Colorado, and we'd love to welcome you to our event tonight, Ben. Thanks for being here. Take it away.
Yeah, well, thank you so much, Misty, for the introduction. Thanks, Logan, and thanks, Delegate Ruth, for letting me be part of this event. As Misty mentioned, I live in Colorado, but I've been so excited and inspired to learn about all you guys are doing in Maryland to reconnect habitat and protect wildlife and drivers alike. So I'm really pleased to be here and honored to be part of this evening. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen here. Does that how does that look? Can I get a thumbs up? Awesome. So the book that I wrote is called Crossings, and it's about the science of road ecology, which is essentially this field of research that looks at how roads shape our landscapes, wildlife, nature. And roads are so powerful, so transformative, in large part because there are just so many of them, right? And I think that's a good place to begin, is with just the incredible planetary dominance of roads. There are 4 million miles of road here in the US alone, around 40 million miles of road around the world, and perhaps 15 million miles more that will be built by the middle of this century. We're in the middle of what some ecologists have called the infrastructure tsunami, this wave of new construction that stands to transform habitats around the planet. And, I think in large part because roads are so ubiquitous, such daily features of our lives, we don't really think about them very much. We tend to ignore them. They're somewhat invisible to us. And when we do think about them, we think about them in fundamentally positive terms because, of course, roads are incredibly useful, right? They're how kids get to school and how people get to hospitals and how farmers get crops to market. They're, of course, these iconic symbols of freedom in the United States. All of our great writers and artists from, Springsteen to Kerouac praise the romance of the open highway. Roads are how we get around. They're these symbols of human mobility and momentum and freedom, which is somewhat ironic or paradoxical because, of course, they do the exact opposite for wild animals, right? They truncate animal movements and curtail their mobility and freedom on a truly massive scale. And I think it's hard to wrap your head around just what a significant ecological crisis roadkill really is. We don't really know how many animals are killed by cars, but the best estimate we have is that more than 1 million animals are killed in the US every day. And that's just vertebrate animals, right? To say nothing of the pollinators that Delegate Ruth also works on, which surely number in the billions. And I think in part because the animals that we tend to see along our highway are the common ones, like white-tailed deer and raccoons and squirrels. We somewhat overlook roadkill as a source of biodiversity loss, as again a true ecological crisis. But there are several dozen federally listed species for which road mortality is the leading existential threat that they face. This is truly one of the major causes of the mass extinction event that we're living in. As Richard Foreman, one of the kind of grandfathers of road ecology, has pointed out, there is literally nothing that we do on this planet that kills more wild animals directly than drive. I think that's a kind of a staggering thing to contemplate. Roadkill is so pernicious in large part because it subverts evolution. You think about the defense mechanisms of so many common creatures, turtles that withdraw into their shells. And this is a box turtle, but of course, Maryland wood turtles are, one of the primary species imperiled by cars. You've got turtles drawing into shells. You've got skunks spraying, porcupines bristling their quills, right? These are all of these great kind of stand your ground strategies that worked really well for millions of years against mountain lions and wolves and hawks and other natural predators. But of course, when your predator is, an F-150 barreling down the highway at 70 miles an hour, the worst possible thing you can do is hunker down and withdraw into your shell. So I find that really tragic to think about, the way that cars and traffic and our modern automotive era have taken these fundamentally natural defense mechanisms and rendered them not only moot but actually maladaptive. But cars and wildlife vehicle collisions, they're not just dangerous to the animals that are struck. They're also profound dangers to human beings, of course. I'm sure that many people on this webinar have had the profoundly negative experience of hitting a deer or another large animal. And I think for lots of reasons, we overlook wildlife vehicle collisions as public health problems as well as ecological problems. It's almost hard, again, I keep saying this, but it's hard to wrap your head around just what a significant issue this is. But every year in the US, there are up to 2 million DVCs, deer vehicle collisions, every year. That's about one every 30 seconds. So, multiple DVCs will occur during the course of this conversation. These are incredibly expensive events. The average deer collision in the US costs more than $9,000 in hospital bills and vehicle repairs and tow trucks and insurance costs and the loss to hunters and so on. They're also very dangerous events. Up to 400 drivers are killed in deer vehicle collisions every year. And certainly Maryland is not immune to that. At least 14 drivers have been killed in Maryland from 2012 to 2021, and it cost the state more than $100 million in all of those costs that I mentioned earlier. So this is truly a national problem, and Maryland is absolutely susceptible to it. And historically, the way that engineers and transportation departments have tended to handle this problem is by putting up deer crossing signs, right? I'm sure we've all seen, 10 million of these things. And I'll just tell you what I think you've probably intuited over the years, which is that, this Band-Aid that we put on this problem fundamentally does not work, right? There are just so many crossing signs out there that they're fundamentally, they're essentially white noise to drivers. They're sort of visual pollution. We just habituate to them and ignore them. And often you see this kind of thing, deer crossing next 30 miles. And, what driver is going to, remain alert to deer for 30 miles, right? It's just not possible. So there's plenty of research showing that, that signs aren't effective. And yet, signs have become the kind of the default solution. I think that they're this, cheap, very visible public expression of concern that, transportation departments can just kind of slap on this issue. And, you see these things in every country you go to, there's a different sign for a different species. In South Texas, where I visited recently, writing about ocelots, you saw ocelot signs everywhere. But again, none of this signage is really dealing with this problem in any kind of meaningful way. And in fact, I've heard biologists call signs litter on sticks. I think that kind of gets at their uselessness nicely. And I think it's also, really important to point out that, even if signs were effective to some extent in preventing wildlife vehicle collisions, that moment of impact between animal and car, that's only part of the problem that roads cause, right? Roads are also barriers to movement. They prevent animals from navigating the landscape. And certainly signs don't do anything about that enormous ecological problem. And I just wanted to take a second and briefly show you a video that I think illustrates this principle, that it's incredibly difficult for animals to safely cross roadways. And I think, again, this kind of just gets at the immense challenge that these animals face, navigating our kind of anthropogenic landscapes. This is a highway in Wyoming, just a kind of a quiet 2-lane highway, not a whole lot of traffic, and yet you can see that it's really challenging for animals to successfully cross. These are mule deer trying to make it across the highway. Uh-oh. Did that just go away?
It did.
Oh no! Somehow that I guess that video just crashed my PowerPoint. That's never happened before. Just hang on. I've shown that video so many times, and that's a first. So I'll just kind of go a cappella. Waiting for my PowerPoint to restore itself. So briefly, what that video just illustrates is it's incredibly difficult for animals to successfully navigate the landscape. And basically what road ecologists have found in many years of research is that any highway with more than 10,000 or so cars per day is essentially an absolute barrier to the movement of wild animals. And that is, for reference, basically every significant highway on the eastern seaboard is, fundamentally a barrier. Just give me my PowerPoint is reloading. I have no idea why that happened, but I'm sure you're all familiar with technical difficulties.
Well, and Ben, while you're getting that going, I wanted to mention, I only recently saw that my neighborhood, and I've lived here 15 years, has one of those deer crossing signs in it. And I never noticed it in 15 years. So that says a lot, right? About how signage just becomes, part of the landscape.
Yeah, absolutely. You know, that is really telling. And you know, again, there have been a number of studies, you know, basically showing that you know, the presence of signs has no impact on you know, on animal collisions or driver speed or you know, any important metric. Okay, I'm back here. Thank you guys for your patience. Let's see. Okay. All right. Are you guys seeing that?
Almost. Yes, perfect.
Okay, fabulous. So you know, one of the things that I think we overlook, you know, when we fail to talk about, you know, the importance of connectivity and allowing animals to cross roads safely is that, you know, in some ways the loss of connectivity and animal mobility and movement is almost more fatal in some cases than roadkill itself, right? And here's just, you know, one quick map that illustrates that point. This is these are deer locations in Wyoming, and you know, you can basically see you know, these purple blobs are where deer hang out. These are all satellite collared mule deer in southwestern Wyoming, and you know, that kind of white line across the bottom of the screen is I-80, and you know, deer effectively never cross that highway, and as a result, you know, in some particularly harsh winters, you know, deer will actually, you know, up to half of that herd will essentially starve because they can't access all of the good, you know, snowless forage south of the interstate, right? So, you know, a herd of deer can handle a few collisions on the highway. You know, what they can't handle is losing access to all of that habitat. And again, you know, that's not necessarily a problem that white-tailed deer have in Maryland, but I do think it illustrates just, you know, the fundamental importance of being able to navigate the landscape as a wild creature. Here's you know, another kind of similar map that illustrates a similar point. You know, these are locations, satellite collared locations of a young male grizzly bear in Montana trying to cross I-90. And every red X along the highway is a place where that bear approached the highway and basically bounced off, you know, repelled by that kind of wall of traffic. These are, you know, this bear attempted more than 40 crossings over the course of 6 months before he finally made it south of I-90. Here's another you know, map that illustrates kind of a similar point. These are mountain lion locations in Southern California, and those red lines are some of the busiest freeways in the world. You know, the 101 and the 405, and you can see that, you know, those collared mountain lions essentially never cross those highways, and as a result, you know, they were trapped on this little island of habitat, and there have been instances of male mountain lions mating with their own daughters and granddaughters and great-granddaughters because they can't find an unrelated partner, and as a result, you know, these mountain lions are chronically inbred and have entered what scientists call an extinction vortex, this kind of long-term doom spiral. So again, you know, no mountain lions in Maryland necessarily, but you know, this is also happening to bobcats and skunks and coyotes and all kinds of different critters all over the country. So we have these kind of two linked problems, right? We've got, you know, wildlife vehicle collisions, these really problematic, dangerous, expensive events that, you know, imperil both animals and humans. And we've got this connectivity problem, you know, the immense challenge of moving around the landscape for wild animals. So what do we do about those two linked problems? And, you know, really the best tool in our box are wildlife crossings, right? These structures, overpasses, underpasses, tunnels, they come in all kinds of different shapes and sizes. But, you know, the idea is generally the same everywhere you go, which is basically, let's give these creatures a safe and effective way to cross roads so that they can continue on their journeys and not come into conflict with our cars. So wildlife crossings, you know, they really begin as kind of a European innovation. You know, the first were built in the 1950s in France, and you know, wildlife crossings spread to, you know, to Germany and Austria and Switzerland and other Western European countries throughout the kind of the middle of the 20th century. You know, they really became famous in Canada, in Banff National Park. I bet many of you have seen these crossings at some point on vacation. Starting in the 1980s, Banff Park Parks Canada built something like 45 crossings, underpasses and overpasses, often for grizzly bears and elk and other big critters. And those crossings were incredibly effective and did a lot to kind of popularize this technology around the world. Here in the US, the first wildlife crossings pop up in the 1970s. And at first it's really Western states that do a lot of this work. And the reason for that is that out here in states like Colorado, where I live, Wyoming, Utah, we have migratory animals. We have these big herds of mule deer and elk and antelope that move across the landscape in very seasonal, predictable pathways. And that makes it relatively easy to mitigate, right? You get 1,000 mule deer all crossing the highway in Wyoming, and 30 of them get hit, and well, there's a big pile of carcasses, sort of telling you where to put a wildlife crossing, right? So those migratory ungulate herds are relatively easy to mitigate for, and of course, that's not something that you have in the East, but the eastern states are also getting on board, and we'll talk about that in 1 second. So as wildlife crossings, start to pop up in the U.S., a couple of really important points or lessons begin to emerge. One of them is that fences are integral to the effectiveness of wildlife crossings, right? People always ask, how do the animals know how to use the crossings? And basically, the answer is that roadside fences direct them to the crossings, right? So, the big, beautiful overpasses tend to get a lot of attention, but it's really those humble roadside fences that direct animals to the places we want them to go so they can cross safely. Another important feature are jump outs, which are basically these one-way escape ramps. If animals somehow do get through the fence and they get trapped in the road corridor, they can find one of those exit ramps and get out of there. And that's, again, another sort of unheralded but important piece of infrastructure in creating safe roadways for animals and drivers. And frequently, in the early days of wildlife crossing, but even to some extent today, one of the critiques of wildlife crossings is that they're expensive, right? These days the typical overpass costs something like $5 to $10 million. Underpasses, run a million, let's say. That's a pretty ballpark figure that varies wildly based on context. But the idea is that, look, obviously these are somewhat expensive pieces of infrastructure. I think that the rejoinder to that is that they tend to be really good investments, right? We talked before about just how expensive wildlife vehicle collisions can be for drivers and how dangerous. And crossings that prevent 50 collisions a year, as many of them do, tend to pay for themselves very quickly. This is a wildlife crossing in Wyoming on Highway 191 that cost a couple of $1 million. There was lots of hand-wringing about the idea of building a special bridge just for the animals. And of course, within 4 years, this structure had paid for itself through collision prevention. So these are they're good conservation policy, they're good public safety policy, and they're good fiscal policy. Another lesson that that I think lots of transportation departments are learning is that it's important to create a diversity of crossings, right? There's there are all kinds of different species on the landscape, and they all sort of interact with roads in different ways, and they all have their own habitat requirements. There are some species that prefer going over highways. There are some that prefer going under. There are some like reptiles and rodents, smaller critters that require logs and rocks and other sort of smaller habitat features. This is a wildlife crossing just outside of Seattle on I-90, where there's this big, beautiful, very conspicuous wildlife bridge, but there are also a number of, of smaller or not smaller, but sort of less obvious wildlife underpasses. You can see here there's kind of a rock pile and some logs and some other habitat features just to make that structure a little more enticing to wildlife. They've also got these kind of enlarged culverts along streams for sort of riparian associated animals like beavers and muskrats and otters and salamanders. So the point is, again, we've tended to mitigate for the large mammals, the deer primarily, but there are lots of other critters out there that interact with roads and have to get safely across, and I think it's important to account for all of those different species. I'm going to skip this video because the last one did such damage. So again, as I was just saying, we've tended to mitigate for those larger mammals, right? That's white-tailed deer, mule deer, out here in the West, elk, pronghorn, moose. Those are the animals that really mess your car up and endanger your life when you hit them. I think, to me, the kind of the next frontier in wildlife crossings and in road ecology is thinking about those smaller animals, like wood turtles in Maryland, or northern red-legged frogs in Oregon. Creatures that aren't necessarily dangers to public safety, but are truly existentially threatened by cars and require mitigation. I think it's also really important to consider aquatic passage, right? The fact that there are, so many fish species out there, from salmon on the West Coast to, sturgeon and herring on the East Coast, and we don't really think about fish as being impacted by roads, but, every little road culvert, every narrow pipe where, a stream passes beneath a highway is potentially a blockage to aquatic migration, right? So we also need to expand and enlarge our culverts and give aquatic organisms opportunities to move through streams. And here's, I just like this picture. This is an enlarged culvert just outside of Seattle, and here's the chum salmon preparing to go underneath that culvert to spawn. Now, I'll point out too that that culverts are potentially great terrestrial animal passage as well, right? We have something like 2,000 dedicated wildlife crossings in the US, and something like 2 million culverts, and animals in their kind of endlessly flexible, creative, intelligent ways have figured out to use those structures in many cases. There are lots of culverts out there that have kind of become de facto wildlife crossings. And there are lots of things we can do to those existing culverts to make them more effective wildlife crossings. Here's an example in Montana. This is a structure known as a critter shelf. And the idea here is that, in spring, the water comes up, the culvert is sort of partially inundated, but that critter shelf allows bobcats and skunks and weasels and other creatures to move through that culvert without getting their paws wet, right? So not every wildlife crossing has to be this fancy $10 million overpass. There are a lot of cheap tweaks and retrofits that we can do to existing infrastructure to give animals a leg up. And here's one really good example of that. I said before that historically, it's been the Western states that have done a lot of wildlife crossing construction and mitigation. But increasingly, Eastern Seaboard states are starting to get involved in this as well. And Virginia is a really good example of that. And one project I just wanted to briefly touch upon was this, this kind of famous project on I-64 in Virginia. And basically the situation there was that, the state had this kind of chronic, deer kill problem, as well as a connectivity problem for black bears and other creatures. And there were a couple of pre-existing culverts and other stream crossings in that area. Again, these were not structures that had been built for wildlife. These were structures that had been built primarily for the movement of water across the landscape. But, VDOT, the Department of Transportation, realized that, by building roadside fences, you could basically funnel those animals, especially white-tailed deer, to those crossings and basically turn these these kind of hydraulic culverts into functional animal passages. So they fenced off a couple of miles of highway along I-64, and they saw a 92% reduction in deer vehicle collisions. Right, so that's a huge win for public safety. They saw a 4-fold increase in deer usage through those culverts, right? So if you sort of use fences to direct the deer to the passages, they will use the passages. Guess what? And this fencing project recouped its own costs by preventing deer vehicle collisions in under 2 years, right? So this was, again, a relatively modest investment that paid for itself very quickly and is still, reaping dividends for the state of Virginia. So, I think these sorts of projects where, we use infrastructure that's already on the landscape, through things like fencing and critter shelves and other cheap retrofits. I think that's a really exciting and promising direction for wildlife crossings on the Eastern Seaboard. So as Logan mentioned briefly, this is an incredibly exciting time for this issue. As a lot of you probably know, the 2021 Infrastructure Act included something called the Wildlife Crossings Pilot Program. This $350 million pot of funding, competitive grant funding that that states can apply for to build wildlife crossings or to do wildlife crossing planning projects. The first round of grants was announced in December, and it was pretty exciting to see. I mean, there were definitely a lot of the usual Western suspects got big grants, Montana, Colorado, Wyoming, but it was also really exciting to see, states like Missouri and South Dakota and Connecticut and Pennsylvania, Midwestern and Eastern states get funding for wildlife crossing data collection and planning processes as well. So this is, again, this is really, there's this unprecedented pot of funding out there that, is encouraging, lots of states to invest in this issue. And I'm sure that's what Delegate Ruth can be talking about momentarily. So, ultimately the task before us is really to, remake our infrastructure to save biodiversity, right? We know that we're in the middle of this mass extinction event, the sixth in our planet's history, and that cars are an enormously significant reason for that. But we have this incredible opportunity to begin to rebuild some of our roadways and correct some of those historic mistakes that we made, when we built our infrastructure in the mid 20th century. And certainly Maryland is one of those places that has that wonderful opportunity. And I don't want to scoop Delegate Ruth's presentation because she knows infinitely more about the situation in Maryland than I do. But I'll just briefly say that there are these fantastic bills before us that will have the chance to make Maryland into really an Eastern wildlife crossing leader. And I'm looking forward to hearing more about that from Delegate Ruth momentarily. So with that, briefly, I'll say, if this just whet your appetite for, more juicy road ecology content, I did write a book about this stuff that came out in September, as Misty mentioned. The New York Times and the Wall Street Journal, among other publications, both loved it. So, liberals and conservatives coming together around the issue of wildlife crossings and, driver safety. But, and I say that somewhat facetiously, but, I do think one of the wonderful things about this issue is that, it really is nonpartisan, obviously. Everybody cares about wildlife. Nobody wants to get in a deer-vehicle collision. This is an issue that polls incredibly well everywhere it's been polled, including places like, Nevada. This is something that, everybody from the hunting lobby to the Humane Society can get behind. And I think that makes it pretty unique among environmental causes. So with that, there's my email address. I think we're saving questions for the end. But that's how to reach me if you guys do have questions after this evening is over. And I'll say with that, thank you so much. And I'm looking forward to hearing from Delegate Ruth.
Wonderful. Thank you so much for that presentation, Ben. It's incredible to kind of see the background context of this issue and all the work that's already happening in this space. And I think your pictures really demonstrate that there's a lot of good projects already going on the ground. So excited to hear a little bit more next about kind of how those projects, or one method for getting those projects underway through state policy. So it is my pleasure to introduce Maryland Delegate Sheila Ruth. Delegate Ruth represents District 44B in Western Baltimore County. She serves on the Environment and Transportation Committee, so a perfect committee to be working on wildlife crossings. Her priorities include climate, transit equity, racial justice, universal health care, mental health, juvenile justice, disability rights, reproductive rights, and workers' rights. So she works on a lot of important issues. Delegate Ruth has long been a champion on wildlife conservation legislation in particular. She introduced 2 bills related to habitat connectivity this session. As mentioned, one encourages pollinator habitat protection along state highways, and another would comprehensively study, plan, coordinate, and fund wildlife corridor and crossing projects in Maryland. So very excited to hear from Delegate Ruth tonight a little bit more about kind of the background context of her bill and how things are going. Take it away.
Thank you so much. And Ben, thank you so much for being here and for that great presentation. And what a wonderful book. If anybody hasn't read it, I highly recommend it. Also, Ben, you might be interested to know, since you wrote a book about beavers, that there is also a beaver bill this year, not sponsored by me, but by someone else. So I think Ben has done a great job of laying out what wildlife crossings are, what the need is, the why. So I'm going to talk specifically about Maryland and about the bill that I introduced. And I want to also thank my Senate cross-file sponsor, Senator Karen Lewis Young, who was unable to be here tonight, but we're working very hard on trying to get this passed. So the bill is pretty comprehensive, but basically the goals of the bill are to try to address funding, because without funding we can't do any of this, to change the culture so that this crossings idea is a part of everything that they do when they're developing our road and culvert and bridge infrastructure, and to ensure that the State Highway Administration and the Department of Natural Resources are working together, because they each have a piece of the puzzle of the expertise, but they need to come together to share that expertise and make sure that this work gets done. So the bill creates a wildlife crossings fund, a special fund that any monies coming into this effort can be funneled into this special fund, that the fund would be able to be used for everything from planning, mapping, to actually building the infrastructure, to outreach and education, to maintenance and monitoring afterwards. And so any state funds, federal funds, donations, interest, anything else would go into this wildlife crossings fund. We did in the bill set up a funding source, which is a fee on auto insurance, an annual fee on auto insurance, which really should be great, because there is a strong nexus there, because as as Ben explained, this really saves the deer vehicle collisions really cost insurance companies and drivers a lot of money. There are 33,000 deer vehicle collisions a year in Maryland, and we've estimated it costs $200 million or more just in the state, to insurance companies, to drivers, and the state. So this kind of fund could really save the state a lot of money. However, and I was hoping that, I knew the insurance companies would be resistant to it, hoping that we could find some middle ground, maybe negotiate down. But what they're saying is that it would be an administrative burden, and they have some real logistical challenges, such as when somebody changes insurance companies, how do they know if they've already paid the fee? So we're looking at alternative funding sources right now. I don't know that that insurance fee is going to go through, but we definitely want to have a stable funding source, and also partly for state matching grants that for the applying for the federal funds. And the bill does require the State Highway Administration and Department of Natural Resources to track funding opportunities, including the Wildlife Crossings Pilot Program and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act that we're hoping to be able to apply to. And so that they need to track that and apply to any that they deem are appropriate, reasonable, and feasible with the work that they're doing. And then the bill requires Department of Natural Resources and the State Highway Administration to each designate a liaison to work together on this effort, to make sure that we're getting that communication between the agencies and avoiding the silos. And then there's a lot of actual policy regarding the infrastructure in the bill. So first of all, the Department of Natural Resources is directed to study, do maps, develop tools that can be used to identify locations for this. They also, the first step is to identify which species to prioritize for these wildlife crossings. Of course, deer are going to be a big part of it. Deer are not endangered, but the white-tailed deer are ubiquitous in Maryland. And as I already said, there are 33,000 deer vehicle collisions a year, but there are also many smaller animals that are endangered and threatened that are a problem. And so we, in particular, the bill directs them to take special consideration of some of the reptiles and amphibians. It doesn't mention specific species, but some of the ones we've talked about are the wood turtle, which Ben mentioned, tiger salamander, and the diamondback terrapin. So we want to make sure that these are all being considered. So once we have animals identified, develop some tools and maps, then the State Highway Administration has to work together with the Department of Natural Resources to develop design guidelines and put that in their design manuals to try to get this as a part of whatever work that they do. It also then directs if there are bridges, culverts, or roads that are being replaced or rehabilitated that due to just natural wear. It's a natural thing at that point to make sure that those culverts are passable to the species that we've identified needs for crossing. And then the same with building new roads and culverts and bridges, that they should be considering this crossings when they're doing that work as well. And so we're currently working with the State Highway Administration and Department of Natural Resources on some amendments to try to further refine the bill. The Highway Administration had some problems where they felt that the bill was too broad. I think that it points out some places where the language just was not clear, and they interpreted the intent of the bill to be much broader, to really create a logistical burden, increasing project timelines, increasing cost, increasing, their needs. And so really just trying to get those amendments in process right now to really clarify and narrow down the language. And so that's basically it. So right now we had our hearings this week, and Misty was kind enough to testify in both the Senate and the House hearings. And we are just working frantically. We have, I think, 2.5 weeks until what we call crossover, which is every bill has to pass one chamber before crossover to get consideration in the other chamber. So we're trying to get all the differences with the Highway Administration worked out in the amendments, and trying to identify and work out a funding stream before crossover, and hopefully get this on a voting list. And so at that point, I'm happy to answer any questions.
Perfect. Thank you for that great overview, Delegate Ruth. And I know we chatted a little bit more about this earlier this week, but your bill is an incredible kind of combination of a lot of the different aspects of how to work on wildlife crossings through state policy. And it's really exciting to see that, we see a lot of bills that kind of take on one piece, which for many states is a great starting point. But to have a study and a dedicated fund and pursuing a funding source and interagency liaisons, I think it's a really comprehensive bill. So we're really excited to hear about that from you and appreciate it.
Thank you.
I see lots of questions popping up in the chat. I'll keep on monitoring as we go here. I'm going to kind of rotate back and forth between questions for Ben and for Delegate Ruth, and there's probably some that you'll both have some comments on. So starting at the top, we had a question related to the border wall in the southern United States. I think the question was a little bit about what our organizations do to address the border wall. NCEL is nonpartisan. We don't lobby. So what we do is mostly just tracking state policies as they relate to the border wall regarding wildlife. And there have been a few resolutions in like Arizona and New Mexico, basically supporting, making sure that there is habitat connectivity considered. And so that's about the extent of it for our group. I'll let Misty weigh in. I know Wildlands Network is doing more, but question-wise, I think for you, Ben, was there any exploration of kind of how the border wall impacts habitat connectivity in your research that you did for your book? I'm trying to remember if there were specifics from when I read it, but yeah, could you talk a little bit about how that came up?
Yeah, it didn't really come up in the course of working on the book. I mean, I will just briefly say that the border wall to me is it's certainly this enormous problem for everything from coatis to ocelots to jaguars. To me it's sort of emblematic of this larger problem, which is just the amount of fence and wall infrastructure on the landscape too. That's something I think a lot about here in the American West. The fact that there's something like 17 times more fences than roads on this planet, and certainly the West is kind of the land of barbed wire, and all of that sort of fence infrastructure can create an immense obstacle to wildlife. And one of the things that we're doing doing here in Chaffee County, where I live, is just trying to get momentum behind wildlife-friendly fencing and barbed wire removal wherever possible. So there's a lot of infrastructure out there that animals are up against. Roads are sort of the most conspicuous, obvious ones, but certainly walls and fences are another enormous problem, and the border wall is the biggest example of that.
Yeah, and I'll just weigh in really quick. I know that the Wildlands Network has been working to map the border wall and the impacts it's having and the places it's disrupting connectivity. And they also put out a really great story map, which lists 6 priority restoration areas along the border wall. So I'm just going to pop that in the chat for everyone so they can look at it.
Perfect. Thank you. So question for Delegate Ruth. The question is about kind of the deer car collisions and if there are any existing maps or kind of roadkill hotspot analyses for Maryland. And I know your bill addresses deer collisions specifically. So could you speak a little bit more about that?
Yeah, thank you so much. And actually, I think Wildlands Network was able to create a hotspot map from some data on carcasses that came from the state police. That's in the fact sheet. Missy, I don't know if you have a way you can share that with people. They created a great fact sheet. So just from data from the state police on where there's carcasses from collisions, we're able to already start to identify where the hotspot locations are. However, we want to be able to take that data and other data sets and really just start overlaying things and create some of the kind of interactive maps that some of the other states are doing, to really be able to better do that. And so the bill does direct the Department of Natural Resources, subject to the availability of funding, to do a statewide population survey for the deer and create a map. And with amendments, it also creates a possibility for them to add other data sets to that map to the population survey to help identify those.
Thanks. Yeah, and as Ben really did a great job of highlighting, the deer collisions can be a really big selling point for these bills. So I think it's important that there was specific attention made to that issue in Maryland. So I'm going to take kind of 2 questions at once here, both related to kind of maintenance costs of wildlife crossings. So there was one question noticing that the Banff crossing in your presentation, Ben, it says, do these states include fencing and other maintenance in their annual budgets? And then the other question was related to a crossing in Maryland that someone heard it had filled in with sludge. And it was a crossing for frogs and made it difficult for them to continue to use that crossing. So I'm curious if you, in talking with transportation officials or other folks who have worked on these projects, how they've kind of contended with ongoing maintenance. And I'm happy to provide some content too. But yeah, what did you kind of find on that aspect?
Yeah, it's a good question. It's really diverse among states. Maintenance is certainly a big issue for those for those fences. I was just in Florida on vacation, and I was driving I-75, which is sort of one of the sites of some of the first wildlife crossings and fences in this country along a stretch of road called Alligator Alley for Florida panthers. And every once a mile there was a downed tree crushing a fence, and it was just clear that maintenance issue had not been addressed in seemingly years, and that's a really good way to render an otherwise effective fencing and crossing complex ineffective. So maintenance is definitely has to be part of it, and certainly there are lots of states that include annual maintenance, for wildlife fencing in their budgets, and certainly that has to be part of the equation.
And
yeah, that's a great point. Oh, go ahead.
If I could just add that that the bill that we have introduced here does also make maintenance one of the eligible uses of the fund. And I see that Jeanette said, does anyone know who to contact about it? If it's a numbered road, it would be under the State Highway Administration. If that's the case, you can reach out to me and I'll get connected up with that. If it's not a numbered road, it would be the local, the county government that would maintain it.
Perfect. So I'm going to group another few questions for you, Delegate Ruth, kind of all related to sort of the political process within your bill. So First of all, there's a question related to broadly whether you've received any partisan pushback with the bill. And then another couple of specific questions, one about if you've contacted Lieutenant Governor Aruna Miller, since I guess she has been very interested as a traffic engineer. And then lastly, for someone in another district, the district of Delegate Fraser Hidalgo, they're wondering what they can kind of do to help as a citizen who's also in the state of Maryland. So a lot there, but feel free to tackle whatever pieces of that you can.
Yeah, thank you so much. I have not really specifically received any partisan pushback. The only pushback I've received at all is about the insurance fee fund, and there is some partisan conflict about fees generally. But I think everybody sees that this is an important effort. It's not really a partisan issue at all, other than the fee. I have not specifically reached out to the lieutenant governor. I have, of course, been working with the administration, but I think it's a good idea to reach out to her. And for the District 15 resident, and for everybody really, of course, always reaching out to your legislators, your senator and your delegates is always a helpful thing. If you're not familiar with who your legislators are, there's a website, mdelect.net, where you can look up who your legislators are. You can also do it on the General Assembly website as well. And I will mention that Senator Feldman, who you mentioned, is the chair of the Triple E committee in the Senate, which has one of the committees that has jurisdiction over this in the Senate.
Perfect. Thank you. So this is a pretty specific question to Maryland, but I think, I'm curious to hear both your answers, and it also sort of speaks to storytelling and issues of like
Hey, Logan. Is anyone else hearing Logan having a connection?
Yes.
Okay. Logan, would you mind turning off your
familiar
video?
with Susan Hicks turtles? Curious if either similar story you've.
I'm just glad that I'm not the only one.
Yeah. Sorry about that. Can you hear me?
I can hear you, but I think you should turn off your video. I think that'll help. All right.
We didn't hear what you
Okay.
said.
Sorry, we're gonna try one more time. Can you hear me now?
Yeah.
Okay. The question was about whether you're familiar with Susan Haygood, who is a conservationist in Maryland who used a turtle dog to help relocate box turtles that were on roadways. So curious if you've heard of that, or if there are any other stories that have been kind of motivational for encouraging.
I think we got most of that.
Yeah.
I'll just say that I'm not familiar with that particular story, but I do know that the ICC, there are some crossings that were built into the ICC specifically, and I'm sure that led to that. And Ben, I don't know if you're familiar with the story or other stories like that.
No, I don't know the infamous turtle dog story, but now I really want to meet the turtle dog. I guess I would just say, look, there are just so many wonderful wildlife and road related stories out there. I think that, one of the fantastic things about this issue is just, how it inspires and motivates volunteers and local residents to get involved. There are just so many fantastic stories about, amphibian bucket brigades. Like practically every town in the Northeast has one. People who go out there on warm, wet, late winter, early spring nights, like right now, and, move frogs and salamanders across roadways. There are so many great citizen science stories out there, groups of people and communities who, go out and quantify roadkill, along their local roads, and then provide that data to transportation departments and let it inform the location of future wildlife crossings. So this is one of those issues that we can all get involved in different ways. Delegate Ruth mentioned the importance of talking to your elected officials, and that's a really big one. But there are also opportunities to engage directly with wildlife in some ways, and there are lots of great examples of people doing that.
Thank you for that. And sorry about the technical difficulties. Can folks hear me now?
Yes, yes.
Okay, I think I'm in a better location. Great. So we had several questions in the chat just about how many states have currently passed wildlife corridor legislation. A couple of questions about if states have funded similar bills to yours, Delegate Ruth. So I'm happy we'll share some resources afterwards that summarize kind of the state action up to this point. And I'll also flag that NCEL is working with Wildlands Network on a comprehensive report that looks at about the last 25 years. And there have been 70 bills related to corridors and crossings over those the last couple decades. So we'll be sure to share that report out with this group. But yeah, maybe Maryland, Delegate Ruth, if you could talk a little bit about kind of inspiration from other states that guided some of your work. And same with you, Ben, if you have any kind of particular states you want to highlight, that'd be great.
Sure. Well, thank you. Thank you so much for the question. And I've been looking a lot at the work that Virginia has been doing because I think they have a very similar ecosystem to what we have in Maryland. They also have the white-tailed deer. They've been doing a lot of work, and they were just awarded a grant, like I said, from the Wildlife Crossings Pilot Program, $600,000 to develop these tools and identify locations for crossings. So they've done a lot of this mapping, overlaying different data to really identify locations. There's a really great story site that I think Misty probably participated in that was put together by the coalition. I forget what it was called, that you can scroll down and it shows all the different work that's being done in Virginia. I've also looked at New Jersey as well, has done some good work in this area too. They have a good website also.
Yeah, and I'll just say that as a Colorado resident, I mean we've done so much in this state, including passing a $5 million state bill last year that basically creates a source of matching funds for those wildlife crossing pilot program grants. And I mean I think that one very important thing to emphasize about that program that that maybe I didn't address in my presentation is that I mean those are matching funds, right? So basically applicants for that program, which is states, counties, native tribes, et cetera, they basically have to bring 20% of the funding to the table, and then Federal Highway supplies 80% for the project, right? So that so the existence of this big pot of federal money has really galvanized lots and lots of states to pass their own bills allocating funding for crossings, and it's just this kind of incredible 80-20 match program that creates this this wonderful opportunity for states to get a hold of some of this funding. So it's a very exciting situation to be in, and again I think it's largely the western states that have gone really big after that money, but as Delegate Ruth said, Virginia as well as Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Missouri, Kentucky, have gotten funding from that program as well, and it'd be great to see Maryland leverage some of those opportunities too.
Yeah, I think that's a great characterization of kind of what's happening on the federal front right now, Ben. And the states that come to mind for me, Utah last year appropriated $20 million specifically to be serving as matching funds for those federal programs. I just drove down I-15 in Utah the other week, and we have lots of those deer escape ramps now and funnel fencing, and a lot of that is getting funded through those federal programs. So it's really instrumental to get your state thinking about that federal funding. Another Eastern example is Massachusetts just approved a study last year, basically requiring the Department of Transportation to identify which of those federal programs that are currently available are applicable to the state of Massachusetts for working on connectivity work. And so legislators and a lot of other folks are starting to take note that it's a great time to take advantage of all that federal funding. So lots of ways of doing that, and we'll share out some of those other bills that specifically address the funding piece afterwards. So there's another question about kind of the amount of attention to local government in wildlife corridor and crossing work. And so the question was if there's been any efforts directed at local government by way of zoning or master comprehensive plans that require wildlife corridors. So wondering what you saw at the local level, Ben, with your work, and Delegate Ruth, kind of how you were thinking about the local level. Happy to mention a couple bills I know of too.
Yeah, it's funny. That's something that we're working on right now in Chaffee County, Colorado. I'd like to say that my book kind of helped to radicalize some of our county planners and commissioners, and we're kind of revising our subdivision code essentially, and trying to figure out ways of incentivizing wildlife mitigation in subdivision planning, because we're developing so rapidly here, and that's inviting lots of new traffic. So maybe there's some way for developers to contribute to some kind of fund that pays for wildlife crossings. But it's a huge challenge. I mean, I do think it's I've talked to so many road ecologists over the years, and they're very focused, understandably, on the structures themselves, and less so on the kind of the land use policies that are driving so much traffic into a lot of these these habitat areas. So it's a big issue, and I think one that probably not enough people are working on.
Yeah, it is a big issue. And I think, so one of the things that we put into our bill as an eligible use of the fund is grants to local jurisdictions to assist with this. In Maryland, as I mentioned actually earlier, all the numbered roads, including the interstate highways, but also state roads, are maintained by the State Highway Administration. Every other road is maintained by the local jurisdictions. And so if we want to be able to really do this work, it's going to need to involve local jurisdictions as well. So other than allowing for grants to local jurisdictions, my bill doesn't really do anything with that. I think once we start laying the groundwork and getting the mapping and all the tools to really be able to identify locations, we can really look more at how we might work together with local jurisdictions to make sure that the work gets done. I have not seen any instance of local government skewing data, as was mentioned in the particular comment. But the comment talked about hunting, and there is definitely a lot of pressure around the state for hunting to manage the deer. And it is an issue that comes up year after year in the legislature. So I think in Missy and Virginia, didn't they work with the local jurisdictions also?
Exactly. Yep, precise.
Yeah, the few states I know of. So last year, Maine introduced a bill to require having local jurisdictions update their county and general plans to accommodate habitat connectivity. And there's two similar bills this year, one in Utah and one in California. So we'll be sure to share those out as well. But yeah, it's kind of a new area is thinking about, since state transportation agencies are mostly focused on the state highways. There's a lot of roads that don't fall within that jurisdiction, and so it's definitely an important consideration. Misty, feel free to cut me off at any point with time. I know we can go over an hour, but I just want to make sure I'm good. There are a few more questions.
Yeah, if our panelists are all right, you guys ready for a couple more?
Sure.
Okay, let's keep going. Thanks, Kogan.
Okay, so this question is for Delegate Ruth, and let's see. The question is: have there been? Oh, sorry, reading the wrong one here. Okay, here it is. So you mentioned, or we talked a little bit about your pollinator bill. So I think they're interested in, how your bill would protect pollinators along highways. The other bill that you've introduced.
Oh, sure. Thank you so much. That one is the House bill is HB 22, and I can't remember the Senate number off the top of my head. But basically, it directs. So we already have a requirement in statute for several agencies, including the State Highway Administration, to have a pollinator habitat plan. That's been in place since 2016. The State Highway Administration has a plan, but it's been, for most of that time, sort of very light, where they've really focused on some demonstration gardens in rest areas and offices. And, so my bill is really to try to expand that plan to make sure they're making use of the highways, because they have so much space along the highways to be able to protect the pollinators. So it directs them to update their plan to include policies and procedures for creating pollinator habitat along the sides of highways. or along highways, and to maintain those in accordance with the Federal Highway Administration standards, and also for outreach and education of the public, because I think that's a very important part of the process, is that the public understands what's happening. One of the things we see a lot is people get upset because areas along the state roads are not maintained or not mowed, and they contact their legislators and they say, this is not mowed, it's not acceptable, you got to get the State Highway Administration to mow it. And so in some cases that should happen, but we want to make sure that there are areas that are also protected, that the State Highway Administration can protect as pollinators. And so that bill has actually passed out of the Senate version, passed out of committee in the Senate. So I think should be on the floor in the next few days in the Senate. It hasn't got a vote yet in the House, but I'm optimistic that it will soon. And let me just add that the impetus for that bill really goes back probably 20 years or more for me personally, because we've been raising monarch butterflies every year. We bring some in, raise them, and then release them to migrate. And when we first started doing this, there was an area along a highway that had a lot of milkweed, where we would go and collect milkweed to feed them. And then one day we went and all the milkweed was mowed down. So it's really sort of been a personal mission for me for a long time.
Yeah, thank you for that. I know there's lots of other ways to work on pollinator habitat and pesticide issues that Maryland's done some good work on too. So yeah, it's an important issue. And Ben, I know you wrote quite a bit about monarchs and kind of the impacts on insects from roads. Do you want to talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, certainly. I mean, I think that Delegate Ruth has, identified a fantastic opportunity, which is that, roadsides are in many states the largest form of public land, right? Just think about the amount of insect habitat loss that we've suffered over the last couple of centuries, and the proportion of our landscape that's either sterile lawn or, corn and soy monoculture. And those roadsides are some of the last strips of native prairie in many places. And there's, an incredible habitat opportunity there that insects in many cases are already taking advantage of. It's, the famous Midwestern monarch butterfly migration, largely follows I-35 from Minnesota to Texas. But it's also obviously a dangerous habitat as well, and I think there is a risk there in some cases of luring pollinators and birds and other animals to roadsides and then potentially killing them, and that's not to say that creating roadside habitat isn't a good idea, because it certainly is. But there are I think that part of creating that roadside habitat is also managing it in ways that maximize the benefit that it provides while minimizing the risk. And maybe it means setting the milkweed back from the road a little bit, or elevating it slightly, or sort of adjusting mowing schedules, so that that young, tender, juicy milkweed is being promoted at the right time. But the road is a habitat in its own sense, but it's also a dangerous habitat, and part of managing roadsides, I think, is maximizing those benefits and minimizing those risks.
Absolutely. Yeah, there's a lot of considerations about not facilitating movement of wildlife into bad places, but at the same time taking advantage of, the miles and miles and miles of potential habitat along roads. So I think it's an important thing to be thinking about. I definitely have like one or two questions I can ask. I'll see if anybody else has any questions, and then we can wrap up. This is kind of maybe a broad or a little bit more gushy question, but your book kind of brings up all these questions about not only how we align our built environment and our infrastructure with the needs of wildlife, but also some deeper issues about how we change our relationships with wildlife in a world where climate change and development are kind of pushing people into closer contact with animals. And your chapter on the wildlife rehabilitators in Tasmania who are helping rehabilitate wombats that have been struck by cars kind of really underscored some of the compassion that's needed to work on road ecology. And I know you've written about coexistence in your book about beavers as well. So I was just wondering if you think there's any shifts in thinking that are needed with respect to kind of how we live alongside wildlife in our changing world. And then also what lawmakers and other practitioners can do to kind of help encourage people to rethink some of those relationships?
Yeah, that's such a great broad question, Logan, that we should discuss someday over a couple of beers. I guess I'll just say that look, you mentioning the Tasmania wildlife rehabilitator chapter of my book, it just makes me think about another really important reason for these projects that we haven't talked about, which is just the alleviation of animal suffering, right? And I think it's funny because like when you talk to different stakeholders or types of people about wildlife crossings, you hear all of these different arguments for them. You hear engineers talking about driver safety. You hear wildlife biologists talking about the conservation of rare species. You hear hunters talking about the preservation of healthy deer populations to hunt. And those are all really good and important reasons. But I also think it's important to remember that there is literally nothing that we do that causes more pain and suffering to wild animals every day than drive. And when you talk to the average person about why these projects are important, they say things like, "I hit a deer and I watched it with a broken leg limp off into the forest to die, and I cried for an hour," and I just think that's something that we're often afraid to talk about because it feels, Logan, as you put it, a little bit gushier maybe, or less tangible. But we know that these are sentient, social, kin-oriented animals that we're causing to suffer, and I think that's just a great way of bringing yet another audience to this cause, which is all of the Americans who are incredibly concerned about the welfare of wild creatures.
Yeah, I actually hit a possum once and I had to pull off. I was crying so hard I had to pull off the side of the road, and I was standing there crying, and a truck driver pulled up behind me and he got me calmed down. And so it was traumatic. But I think your book, Ben, really highlighted the suffering that it causes animals, not just the roadkill, but all the other aspects. Like there's a whole chapter on the noise and how that impacts the animals. And so it was really just amazing to learn about that. Amazing is not the right word, but
yeah, no, I mean that's a great point too. We've been talking about two very specific problems, right? Roadkill and habitat connectivity. But you've also got the noise pollution issue. That's a huge public health crisis for humans as well as an ecological crisis. You have the road salt problem. The fact that we're applying salt as a de-icer in enormous quantities and poisoning our rivers and lakes that way. You have tire particles that have caused giant fish kills in some places. So roadways are truly one of the great ecological problems of our time, and I'm really grateful that there are people working on this issue.
Yeah, thank you for that. And I just want to put a plug in for the book again. There's a lot of different aspects, like, the compassion element, a really great chapter at the end of Ben's book, also on kind of how highways have been used historically to fragment people and communities, that I think is a really important read and connects to all this too. So just a big plug again for Ben's book. Misty, I think I'll turn it back to you. I think we've gone through most of the questions. So if you want to take us through some wrap up, that'd be great.
Absolutely. I just want to thank all of our panelists again for your time. I know, especially Delegate Ruth, you're in the middle of a busy session. We so appreciate you taking time tonight. And Ben, you've done such great work traveling the world, coming up with all these stories and putting them together in such a beautiful book. I was reading it on the way home on the train today from Maryland. So these two bills that Delegate Ruth mentioned are going to be voted on any day. And we really would love to see them enacted to make Maryland safer for both wildlife and people. So I encourage all of you that can here on the call today, please contact your legislators and tell them to support these bills. And I'm actually going to be following up after this with a recording of the session, some of those follow-up links that Logan mentioned, and I'll also include a little action alert to tell you things you might want to say, how to find out who your legislators are, and make sure you know that your voice matters. It really does. So if you're able at all, take action right away. We don't know when these will be voted on, but it will be soon. And as Delegate Ruth said, we need to get these through committee to make sure that they move forward. So thank you so much for all of you for coming out tonight and caring about this issue and taking the time to make Maryland a safer place for people and wildlife. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks again, Ben and Delegate Ruth and Misty, for the opportunity.
Awesome.